Welcome to Chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to be discussing some of the research methods commonly used in psychology. We'll go over some of the basics for describing and evaluating data, and we'll be giving a brief overview of the ethics involved in conducting research. So let's get into it. Dufar. In the early history of psychology, before it was even its own field, many of the philosophers that would come to think about psychology-like questions relied very heavily on rationalism, which is the idea that knowledge can be obtained through reasoning. But as psychology came into its own, it was argued that reason alone isn't sufficient. You might be able to already see some of the flaws in relying on reasoning only for conducting a scientific field, but let's focus on one example that kind of highlights why this could be problematic. So we might logically reason that anyone would notice something as obvious as if the person that you're talking to was replaced by a new person entirely. That seems logical. However, the phenomena of change blindness actually tells us otherwise. In studies that have been conducted where, due to some kind of distraction or some kind of attention-grabbing event, if you swap the individual that a participant is talking to and they don't notice the change while it's happening, they will continue on in the interaction as though the change had never happened. And in repeated studies, 50% or more of participants fail to notice this theoretically obvious swap. If you'd like to watch a neat little video showing how that happens, there's a link down here at the bottom to a YouTube video. So this is one example of how reasoning would fail to explain something that we tend to observe fairly commonly. So that brings us to the idea that empiricism, rather than rationalism, might be the better way to go. And so empiricism is pretty central to psychology as a field, as well as other sciences. And this is the idea that knowledge can be obtained through observation and experience. And that's basically what the scientific method is observing and experiencing things in a structured manner, and then drawing appropriate conclusions based on what you've observed. So we're going to be focusing on a method of employing empiricism as we work through this chapter. As psychologists, we're trying to understand behavior. So we assume that there are some kind of laws or rules that are guiding behavior, but we don't necessarily know what those principles are. So we're going to be using experiments and research and different kinds of study to see if we can uncover what each of those principles that govern our behavior are. And so for some of the major goals in doing science, we can look at things like measurement and description. Maybe we just want to be able to measure and accurately describe some kind of phenomenon that occurs in the world. So maybe we want to be able to measure and describe how social people are. You may see a news article headline that says that in a particular population, say 70% of people are extroverted and the rest are mostly introverted. That would be something where you're measuring and describing which people identify with which kind of social category. We might also want to try and understand and predict. So instead of just describing something that exists in nature, maybe we want to understand why it exists, or perhaps we want to be able to predict what might happen if a change were to occur. So this is where we start getting our hypotheses. So we can form a hypothesis about how two or more variables might interact. So we might say something like, hanging around people who are extroverts might make someone more social. That would be an understand and predict, because we're making a prediction that hanging around people who are social should also increase your sociability. For our third type of goal, we have application and control. This is the idea of using that information that we've gathered in the earlier stages to try and put it into some kind of practical use. So maybe we're going to try and solve problems, like, I guess, making people more social if that's what's required in a particular situation or something like that. So we have these three different sort of categories that we can be trying to achieve with scientific enterprise. So we can either just be trying to sort of quantitatively describe and measure what's going on in the world. We might try and form some predictions and understand what a relationship between different items might be, or we might try and use what we know to change and control a situation. So those are the basics broken down here. So now that we've established some of the goals of conducting research, let's actually look at a breakdown of the scientific method itself. Now, this is going to be sort of a vague overview of how one might conduct research. There are always sort of little changes and things might adjust in the real world depending on where things go wrong, but I'll try and draw attention to each of those at each of these steps. So for our version of the scientific method, we're going to talk about step 1 as identifying the problem. So maybe you observe something in the real world and you want to figure out what's going on with it. We can use a fairly commonly talked about example, the idea of video games leading to more violence in youth. So maybe you've noticed that modern video games tend to be more violent than they used to be in the past, and maybe you're noticing more violent reports in the news, and you'd like to know if those two are related. So we've identified a problem, we've identified something of interest that we want to look into. It doesn't necessarily have to be a problem as we might think of it non-scientifically, but maybe we just think of it as something that we want to know more about. So that leads us to step 2. So now that we've figured out what it is that we want to look at, now we're going to start gathering information. So we want to look into what's out there already. What kind of research has already been done? What kind of literature exists that might give us some insight as to what's going on? Once we've established that base knowledge, we move on to step 3, which is generate a hypothesis. So what do we think is going on? Based on everything that we've read, what do we think is happening? What do we think the relationship is? And from that, how can we predict what might happen in a situation? So if our broad theory is the idea that violent video games lead to more violent behavior, then our specific hypothesis would be that, say, playing violent video games would lead to an increase in violent behavior. Now that sounds awfully close to something that we could test via an experiment. So we can move on to step 4, which is design and conduct an experiment. Now, we're here using the example of an experimental setup, but as we'll find as we move through this chapter, experiments aren't the only option. We could conduct correlational research, so we could start comparing two different measures without manipulating anything, if that's what we were interested in, or if that's all that we could do. But for our introduction here, we're going to stick to an experiment, because that's probably what we are most used to thinking about. Now, we will be going over most of the components that are involved in designing and conducting experiments, at least superficially later on, but for the basics of it, we want to think about things like, who do we want to work with in this study? Whose behavior are we wanting to watch? Who are we thinking are going to be playing violent video games? We're also going to want to think about things like, which video games are you going to use? What kind of a setup are you going to use? All that sort of stuff. So there's lots going into designing the experiment, and once you've thought out all of those little aspects of the experiment, then you would carry out the experiment and start collecting your data. So if you're having people play violent video games and then you want to measure their violence levels afterwards, you want to somehow measure their violence. Are we going to look at, say, emotional outbursts or something like that? You'd have to quantify that and then take measures of it. And then we can move on to step 5, where we analyze the data that you've collected. And from those analyses, you also want to be able to draw some kind of conclusion. So you want to look at your information that you collected. You want to say, okay, were people who played violent video games more aggressive than those who didn't? What can we say there? Typically, your conclusion will be in some kind of statement like, people who played violent video games either were or were not more violent after playing those games than people who didn't play violent video games. And from that conclusion, we then have a couple of different routes here. So our scientific method list says that step 6 is to restart the process. And what that means is, given what you've learned, you may want to go back, form a new hypothesis, and conduct follow-up research. You want to see if what you observed in the group that you just studied holds in, say, a different group. Or maybe you didn't find a difference between the two groups, and you think maybe there was something wrong with the design of your experiment. So you want to change some stuff up and do it again. However, this, again, is a little bit misleading. You don't always have to go back to the drawing board after conducting an experiment. Maybe you found your conclusions and now you're ready to share that with the literature. So at the beginning, when you were gathering information, you looked at studies that others had done on that topic. So once you've made your conclusions, maybe you're ready to publish your own research and add to that literature so that others can learn from what you did in their own research. So this restart the process can happen, but doesn't have to always happen, just to keep you informed of that. Now, before we go any further here, I want to stop and take a look at some of the terminology that you're going to hear as you start talking about research. I've tried to keep the terms fairly vague or fairly general so far, or at least giving you definitions as those terms come up. But here's going to be a list of some of the important things that we're going to need to know about as we move forward in this chapter. So we might talk about a variable. And a variable is really just a fancy way of referring to any kind of characteristics, anything that we might measure. So these are things that are called variables because they can vary. So we might look at an experiment and we want to compare overall performance in a course compared to the number of hours a student studies each night. Both the number of hours studied and the grade that a student obtains in a course would be considered variables because they have sort of a span of numbers that could come up, and they can vary depending on the individual that we are measuring. So variable is just sort of a broad term to talk about the thing that we are measuring. Our next definition here is actually an operational definition. So this is a way of giving something a definition. So our operational definition will define a variable in terms of the specific procedures that are used to produce or measure it. So this is basically saying that we have an operational definition that tells everyone exactly what it is that we're looking at with our variable. So if I talk about number of hours studied each night, an operational definition would be some kind of concrete, measurable definition of how we would get that. So maybe we would have students report the number of hours studied using a survey or something like that. So that tells other people who might be either reading our research or wanting to replicate our research how we did it, and specifically what we were looking at. So you know exactly what we're calling number of hours studied, exactly how that was obtained, and what it means to the data and to the conclusions that we're drawing. We might also see the terms participants or subjects. Sometimes you'll see these used interchangeably. They're used to refer to the organisms whose behavior is being systematically observed in a study. Typically, you'll see people use the term participant to talk about human subjects, and you'll see subjects in general used to describe non-human animals. But that's not always the case. That just sort of tends to be what you see. You might have them interchangeably used here, but that's what those terms mean. The last thing I want to mention on this terminology and general discussion part at the beginning here is statistics. So statistics are what we use to analyze our data and decide if the hypotheses we posed were actually supported or not. So we'll go into more about statistics later on, and sort of give you an idea of what kinds of things statistics look at in order to draw those conclusions. And then our last point is kind of like what I mentioned at the end of our scientific method list, where once you've found something, once you've made a conclusion, whether it's supporting or going against your original hypothesis, those findings are typically published or shared through reports at some kind of scientific meeting or in a scientific journal. So this is part of the scientific literature. So once you've discovered something or found that something isn't what you thought it was, you share those findings with others so that that can add to their knowledge of the field. So scientific meetings could be things like conferences where you give a talk and explain what your research was about. Or a scientific journal could just be publishing your findings, publishing a full paper that tells other researchers and those who are interested what kind of research you conducted, how you conducted it, and what your conclusions were at the end. So those are good things to keep in mind as we think about conducting different kinds of research throughout this chapter.